am Vera Caldwell. I am a mother, a widow, and the trustee of a $2.5 million family trust. The night my son, Ethan, looked at me across his gleaming Cherry Creek living room and said, "Mom, there's no place for you this Christmas," the sentence fell like snow, soft on the surface, freezing underneath. I did not plead. I stood, smoothed the front of my coat, and told his wife, Sabrina, my daughter-in-law who loves tradition more than truth, to have a lovely holiday. If stories like this speak to you, tap like and subscribe. Ring the bell so you do not miss the next chapter. Your support helps more people find quiet courage. The room smelled of expensive vanilla, the kind that makes strangers feel rich. The tree was 12 feet high. The ornaments were new. The money had my fingerprints. Ethan watched the floor instead of my face. Sabrina watched my hands, as if kindness might reach for her once more. I gave them both what they wanted. Silence. Outside, Denver was already turning white. I walked the long hallway where family photos shrink a mother down to a corner, pressed my palm to the cold brass handle, stepped into air that tasted like a clean goodbye. Headlights cut the falling snow. Wipers kept time. Neighborhood windows glowed with other people's warmth. I did not cry. I drove. My name is Vera. I was married to a carpenter who taught me the value of quiet work. When he died, I learned another lesson. Quiet can also be a blade. I kept books, paid bills, and built a fund meant to steady our family through storms. Then I learned some storms are invited in by the people you love. I parked in front of my small brick house and let the engine tick down. Snow dusted the windshield like ash. Justice does not shout, it waits. I took off my gloves. I set my phone on the counter. I stared at the framed photo of the life I earned and the table where I now eat alone. I promised myself something simple. If I was not welcome at their table, my money would not sit at it either. I drove home under the falling snow. 2 days later, my phone would light up with 27 missed calls. I remember the curtains. They were pale gold linen, heavy and tailored. I helped pick the fabric when Ethan and Sabrina first bought the house. Sabrina wanted something that photographed well. She didn't know how to sew, so I hemmed them myself. I remember standing on a ladder while Ethan held the pins, pretending to be useful. He smiled then. It was a different kind of silence. Now the curtains still hung there, unchanged, but I no longer had a place beneath them. That morning, I opened the old file folder I kept in my bedroom dresser. It was thick with receipts. Home Depot, West Elm, Pottery Barn, sofa cushions, backsplash tile, light fixtures, custom frames. Their house was my retirement plan in disguise. Every choice, every swipe of my card had been coded in love and unspoken expectation that there would be a chair left for me at the table I helped build. I once paid for the down payment when their loan fell short. "Just until the bonuses come in," Ethan had said. The bonus never came. But I didn't press. I never did. Love made the silence easier to justify. There was a photo on their mantle. I saw it the night I was dismissed. Ethan, Sabrina, and their 2 kids standing on a beach somewhere in California. Everyone in matching sweaters. I wasn't in that photo, but I had bought the sweaters. I stood in my hallway now, holding a framed picture of Ethan at 7 years old, sitting in a cardboard fort we built from refrigerator boxes. He was grinning, wild-haired, missing a front tooth. I used to believe that version of him was still somewhere inside the man who asked me not to come. But the evidence was fading. Every inch of their home had my fingerprints. The bar stools, the French press, the hardwood refinishing after the water leak. I helped paint the nursery when Sabrina was too tired to stand. I bought the stroller she pushed through Cherry Creek shopping district like a badge of status. When people complimented her, she never mentioned me. I stared at the records spread across my bed. My name was never on the deed, not on the mortgage, not even on the gift letters. But the money flowed from me like an invisible vein feeding a body that no longer acknowledged its source. They said it was about space, that there wasn't room for me, but I had made room financially, physically, emotionally, over and over again. I made room when I moved into a smaller house so they could afford theirs. I made room when they needed childcare and couldn't pay for it. I made room when I let their mistakes live rent-free in my forgiveness. That morning, I realized something sharp. I wasn't excluded by accident. I was removed on purpose, not forgotten, erased. I sat at my dining table, smaller than theirs, older than theirs, but mine. I spread the receipts out like cards and stared at them until the ink looked like bruises. Love doesn't always come with a thank you, but disrespect often arrives dressed as tradition. I didn't feel anger, just clarity. A long, slow unfolding of facts I had been refusing to see. And when I did finally see them, I knew what I had to do next. I can still feel the chill of the brass doorknob. That night, after Ethan spoke his sentence, I stood in their hallway a moment longer than necessary. Not because I was unsure, but because I wanted to remember. The family photographs on the wall had changed over the years. At first, I was everywhere, holding newborns, laughing in kitchens, wrapping scarves around tiny necks. Then fewer, then smaller. By the end, I was a blurry figure in the back of a graduation photo, half hidden behind a bouquet. I ran my fingers lightly across one of the frames. It was dusty near the top. No one cleaned that high unless they were looking for something. I used to clean everything. Now I wasn't needed, not even in the corners. Sabrina stood behind me, not close enough to touch. Her heels clicked once on the floor, a tiny reminder of whose house it was now. I turned slightly and nodded. "Tell them, Merry Christmas," I said, not bitter, not angry, just finished. She didn't reply. She didn't have to. Her silence was a language we both understood. I wrapped my scarf, careful with the ends. My coat was thick wool, the kind that lasts through seasons and heartbreak. I zipped it up to my chin, adjusted my gloves, and opened the door. The snow was still falling, light and slow, like feathers giving up. It settled onto my shoulders without asking permission. The air bit at my cheeks as I stepped down onto the walkway. Porch lights glowed in the distance. I could see silhouettes behind windows, families gathering, laughter flickering behind curtains. A warmth I once believed was permanent. My boots crunched softly as I walked to the car. No one followed. No one watched. I paused before opening the driver's door. Took one long breath. I had cooked in that kitchen, changed diapers in that guest room, folded blankets on that very couch. And now I was leaving like a visitor who'd overstayed. Only I hadn't. Inside the car, the engine hummed. I turned on the headlights and watched the beams push through the snow. My wipers moved back and forth, steady as breath. I looked once more at the house in the rearview mirror, a warm light in every window, but none for me. I did not cry. I placed both hands on the wheel and drove into the night. They had told me there was no place for me, so I made one, elsewhere. I sat at my kitchen table with a yellow notepad and a calculator that beeped too loudly in the quiet. The snow outside had stopped, but its hush still hung in the air. I pressed the buttons carefully, double-checking each figure like I used to do with our grocery lists when Maria was alive. Back then, we had stretch meals and make-do weeks. But we had enough, and we had each other. The first number I wrote down was $20,000, the amount I wired for their down payment when the appraisal came in low. Sabrina had cried on the phone, said it was their dream home. Ethan didn't call me himself. He sent a text that said, "If you can, Mom, no pressure." I answered, "Of course." Then came the $7,000 for the roof repairs, the $15,000 for the kitchen remodel, the recurring babysitting costs I never charged, the bills I paid when they were between paychecks. Add in the credit card I let Ethan use during their second pregnancy, the one he never returned. Every holiday, I brought more than gifts. I brought coverage, so they wouldn't have to. I totaled the numbers. Then I looked at my bank balance. The difference was staggering. I had spent more on helping them build their life than I had spent building my own in the last decade. I hadn't bought new shoes in 2 years. I skipped dental appointments. I cut my own hair. I let the roof leak in the corner of my bedroom because it only dripped when it rained hard. Love had become a currency, and I had been spending it like it would return with interest. I remembered the second mortgage I signed when Ethan's job fell through. The banker looked at me, brows raised, pen in hand. "Are you sure, Miss Caldwell?" he asked. I was. I thought, this is what mothers do. But I was wrong. Mothers don't erase themselves to be useful. They don't set themselves on fire to keep someone else's holiday warm. I looked down at the paper. The numbers didn't lie, and they didn't flinch. They just sat there, a quiet monument to every moment I had said yes when I should have paused. I had mistaken sacrifice for love, thinking the more I gave, the more I'd be seen. I thought generosity guaranteed belonging. I thought being needed meant being valued. Maria once warned me, "Make sure you're not trading your peace for their comfort." He always said things like that, gently in the dark, when our son was asleep and the world felt still. I didn't listen then. I do now. I pressed the final total into the calculator. The screen blinked, 237,468. Not adjusted for interest, not including the pieces of myself I chipped away along the way. I closed the notebook and placed it in the drawer beside the trust folder. Love shouldn't need receipts. But sometimes, you have to count the cost to understand the loss. Maria used to say things I didn't want to hear until life made them true. He never raised his voice. He believed truth didn't need volume to carry weight. I remember once, after Ethan had borrowed money and forgot to say thank you, Maria poured me a cup of tea and said, "Don't buy love, Vera. Earn respect or teach others to." I waved him off then, made excuses. He's young, he's stressed, he means well. Maria just smiled into his mug and said nothing else. That memory returned as I stood in the grocery store, staring at a small tin of imported cocoa I used to love. It was $9.99. I held it for a moment, turned it over in my hands. Then I placed it back on the shelf. I had skipped small joys for years, passed over soft scarves, new gloves, birthday cakes, perfume samples. I lived modestly, not because I had to, but because they needed more than I did. That was the story I told myself. But now, in that store aisle, I felt something shift. Not bitterness, just a hollow recognition. I had trained myself to believe that less for me meant more for them, that every denied treat or quiet no was proof of love. I had edited myself out of comfort and called it motherhood. I drove home without the cocoa. At home, I opened the hall closet and pulled down the old photo box, the one with our wedding pictures, vacation postcards, school drawings. I found the photo from our 20th anniversary. Maria in a navy wool sweater, holding my hand in front of a mountain lake. He had written on the back, "Still with you, even when I'm not." I set the photo in its frame and placed it on the mantel. For years, I had let their wants shout over his wisdom, but now, in the quiet of my house, I could hear him again, his voice steady as always. "Don't buy love, Vera. Love that's real doesn't need receipts, but it does require boundaries." I looked around my living room. Nothing new, nothing matching, but everything was mine. The knit blanket on the couch, the stack of library books, the lamp with the crooked shade, the silence. I walked to the window and watched snow begin to fall again, soft, clean, forgiving. "You were right," I whispered. I kept buying silence. I touched the photo frame once more and left the room, not to forget, but to remember differently. The call came just after noon. I was folding laundry, the smell of clean cotton in the air, when my phone lit up with Sabrina's name. I let it ring once before answering. I didn't rush, not anymore. "Hi, Vera," she said, sugar laced with static. "I hope you're staying warm." There was a pause, long enough to reveal what she really wanted. "My parents are flying in next week. We're hosting a dinner, just a small gathering of close friends. They'd like things to be refined, traditional." I held the phone a little farther from my ear. "I remember when traditional meant casserole and pie," I said. Sabrina gave a soft laugh that didn't quite land. "Right. Well, we've grown past that. Ethan's on board. He thinks it'll be lovely." I said nothing, just listened to the clink of glass in the background, the faint sound of someone directing a florist. She went on, breezy and efficient. "If you come, we'd appreciate something understated. Maybe navy, and perhaps no mention of past Christmases. It just keeps the energy light." I could feel her shaping the evening like a showroom display. Nothing too sentimental, nothing too real. No chipped teacups, no handwritten recipes, no reminders of where the foundation came from. I remembered the year Ethan had strep throat on Christmas Eve, and I sat beside his bed all night with a cool cloth on his forehead. I remembered the first turkey I ever cooked for the bakers when Sabrina's mother had a migraine. That dinner won praise for weeks. Now I was being asked to stay invisible, present but not seen, like a prop that didn't clash with the decor. I looked out the window. The sky was the color of old pearl, still, cold. "What exactly do your parents expect from me, Sabrina?" I asked, voice low. She hesitated. "Just that you be gracious. After everything, it would help the mood." I smiled without warmth. "Gracious," I repeated. "Like when I made your wedding veil by hand because you didn't want to spend the extra $500. "That was different," she said quickly. "We were young. We were appreciative then." "And now?" I asked. Now was silence. I reached for a cloth napkin, began folding it into a square. "Refined enough to eat my food when times were tight, but not enough to share a table with me now." Sabrina's voice changed. "That's not fair." "No," I said. "It's precise." There was another pause. She didn't hang up. Neither did I. "Just think about it," she said finally, the sweetness returning like a glaze over bitterness. "It's important to us." "Of course," I said, folding the last napkin. "I'll take care of everything." I ended the call. Then I set the phone down, turned to the window, and let the silence settle again. The second call came that evening. I was simmering lentils when the phone buzzed again, Sabrina once more. I let it ring 3 times before answering, wiping my hands on a towel. "Hi again," she said, her tone brisker now. "Quick thing. My father was asking who else might be at the dinner. He mentioned your late husband. Maria, was it?" I leaned against the counter, heart slowing. "It was," I said. "Well, I suppose it's just good to know who will be discussed. My parents are very careful with legacy. They come from a world where everyone understands their place." I let her words settle like a draft across bare skin. "Maria knew his place, didn't he?" she added. "Hard-working, simple, honest, the kind of man people remember fondly, but quietly." The spoon in my hand paused mid-stir. My knuckles tightened. I placed the spoon gently in the sink and picked up the phone with both hands. "Maria," I said slowly, "had more grace in his silence than your family has ever mustered in its noise." Sabrina exhaled, startled. "Vera, I didn't mean—" "You did," I said. There was a sharp quiet between us, the kind that usually follows something breaking. "We're done pretending, Sabrina," I continued. "Pretending I'm welcome. Pretending this is mutual. Pretending tradition is anything but control with better dishes." She scoffed, trying to regain ground. "You're blowing this out of proportion." I laughed once. "No, dear, I'm seeing it in proportion, for the first time." She shifted tones again. "If you don't come, people will notice. Let them. You'll regret this." "No," I said, calm and final, "but I suspect you might." Then I ended the call. I stood for a moment in my kitchen, the lentils still bubbling, the window fogging with warmth. Outside, snow had started again. Inside, the line had been crossed, and I had drawn it. I woke early the next morning, before the sky turned silver, before the neighborhood stirred. The house was quiet, the kind of stillness that follows certainty. I made a cup of coffee, black, no sugar, and sat at the small table near the window. Snow clung to the corners of the glass. I watched it melt slowly, like hesitation finally giving way. The trust folder sat in front of me. It was thick, worn at the edges, bound in brown leather. Maria had helped me draft it years ago, when the idea of growing old alone was only a shadow, not yet a shape. "Prepare while you still feel strong," he had said. I didn't know then how right he would be. I flipped through the pages until I reached the section I knew by heart. Clause 7.3. In the event that the trustee identifies misuse, manipulation, coercion, or financial negligence that may threaten the security or intent of the trustee may, without prior consent from the beneficiaries, suspend disbursements and freeze access until such misuse is evaluated or resolved. I read it once, then again, and then I reached for my phone. The line rang twice before a calm voice answered. "This is Carla with West and Mountain Trust Services. How can I help you today?" "This is Vera Caldwell," I said. "Trustee of the Caldwell Family Trust. I need to initiate a freeze on the primary account." She didn't respond right away. I could hear the click of keys in the background, the hum of a distant printer. Then she spoke, voice measured. "Yes, Ms. Caldwell. You're listed as sole trustee with full authority. May I ask if this is in relation to suspected misuse?" "It's in relation to repeated disrespect," I said, "which has turned into neglect, and Clause 7.3 covers both." There was a pause. Not hesitation, just process. "I understand," she said. "We'll flag the disbursement schedule as suspended effective immediately. That includes debit activity, scheduled transfers, and access to joint usage cards. Would you like notification when the freeze is confirmed?" No need, I replied. I already know it's the right decision. She thanked me for calling. I ended the conversation and placed the phone down gently, like it was the final page of a book I had taken too long to finish. I stared at my hands. They didn't shake. For years, I had handed out love in envelopes and wires, wiring comfort into people who no longer made room for me in their lives. I had funded birthdays I wasn't invited to, paid for vacations I only saw through Facebook posts. I gave and gave, believing that generosity was the same as security. But love without respect isn't family. It's a transaction. And I was done funding their lifestyle while being erased from it. I rose from the table and walked to the desk in the living room. I opened the drawer and pulled out every copy of the trust summaries, bank statements, gift letters, tax documents, all of it. I stacked them neatly, then pulled out a black pen. I wrote 3 words across the top page. Suspended until noticed. I capped the pen and slid it back into its place. Then I sat once more and let the stillness wash over me. Not grief this time, not guilt. Something steadier, something clean. They had mistaken my silence for permission. Now they would learn it was preparation. And justice, at last, was mine to authorize. That evening, I built a fire. I hadn't used the fireplace in years. It was more for memory than heat. A space Maria once tended with care, his hands steady as he stacked the wood just so. I mimicked the way he used to do it. 2 logs, cross-hatched, kindling in the center, a single match. The flame caught slow, then fast. I sat cross-legged on the rug and fed it 1 sheet at a time. Old printouts, duplicates of receipts I no longer needed, notes scribbled during phone calls that were never returned, a photo of Ethan and Sabrina in front of their house, the house I helped them buy, both smiling like their lives had no roots. The fire didn't rage. It simply breathed. I stood and opened a bottle of red wine, the one I'd been saving for someday. I poured it into my favorite glass, the one with a tiny chip on the rim, and carried it back to the fire. I didn't toast. I didn't whisper anything dramatic. I just sat with the glass in one hand and the crackle in the other, letting the warmth soak into my skin. I looked around the room. It was small, filled with mismatched furniture and old books, thrifted curtains and secondhand rugs. Nothing here made a statement. But everything had a story. For once, I wasn't watching the clock. I wasn't waiting for anyone to call. I wasn't checking the mail for thank you cards that never came. I was just here, in my home, in my peace. I thought about all the meals I had cooked for people who didn't stay. All the times I said yes because it was easier than explaining the hurt of being taken for granted. I thought about the emails I was never copied on, the decisions made without me, the polite smiles that didn't reach their eyes when I walked into the room, and I thought about what had changed. Not them. Me. I sipped the wine. It was dry and deep, with a taste that lingered. I liked that. It reminded me that some things were meant to stay. On the table nearby, the trust folder remained closed, not hidden, not forgotten, just waiting, like I had waited, for the right moment. The fire had calmed now, glowing more than burning. I let the final paper fall into the embers, an old to-do list with their birthdays circled. I didn't need it anymore. I remembered their dates. I just didn't need to chase them with gifts. I leaned back in the chair Maria once called his thinking seat. The wine sat warm in my chest. The room breathed with me. For the first time in years, Christmas Eve felt like mine. No obligations, no noise, no debt dressed as duty, just a fireplace and a glass of red wine, and the quiet joy of knowing I had finally chosen myself. The message came the next day, short and bright, as if nothing had happened. "Hi, Vera. Quick favor. Could you pick up my parents from the airport? Their flight lands at 2 p.m. Just wear something decent. Thanks so much." No greeting, no question mark, just the assumption of my compliance, tucked neatly behind a smiley face. I read it twice, then set the phone down beside my coffee. The living room was quiet. The fire from the night before had left a soft trail of ash in the hearth. The air still smelled faintly of cedar and warm stone. Outside, a layer of snow rested untouched on the porch railing. I stirred sugar into my mug and leaned back into the chair. It was always like this with Sabrina, requests disguised as niceties, expectations camouflaged as courtesy. I picked up the phone again, reread the message. Not a word about our last conversation, not a single acknowledgement of the lines crossed. Just the next order, the next assumption that I'd say yes, because I always had. I set the phone face down and let it rest there. The thought of Celeste and Harold walking through the arrivals terminal, scanning the crowd for someone in pearls and pressed navy, was almost comical. I imagined Sabrina's voice. She'll be holding a sign. She knows how to behave in public. They didn't want family. They wanted a chauffeur with good posture. I stood slowly and walked to the window. The sun was low, casting a quiet amber glow over the driveway. My car sat there, covered in a soft coat of white, waiting, like it always was. I thought of all the favors I'd done that were never called favors. All the late-night babysitting shifts, the holiday meal prep, the silent gift cards slipped into drawers when bills were overdue. No one thanked me, but they all counted on me. I returned to the table and picked up the phone again. "Of course, I'll take care of everything," I typed and sent it. Not because I would, but because I was setting the stage. Sometimes compliance is camouflage. I stood and went to the closet, pulled out my winter coat, and dusted it off. Then I reached for my leather case, the one with the documents inside. I clicked the latches open and checked the folders one by one. Trust paperwork, bank letters, printed screenshots, all labeled, all in order. At 12:15, I brewed a fresh pot of coffee. At 12:40, I ironed my blouse, the same navy one I wore the day I became a trustee. At 1, I sat back down at the table, opened a crossword, and circled one of the clues. Delayed gratification. 7 letters. I wrote the answer slowly, one square at a time. Postpone. I smiled. Help comes in many forms, and some favors return with interest. I didn't go to the airport. At 2 p.m., I poured myself another cup of coffee and turned the page of my crossword. The kitchen was quiet, except for the hum of the heater and the ticking of the wall clock. Steady, patient, unconcerned. I glanced at the next clue. Something kept waiting, on purpose. 8 letters. Postponed. I filled it in and smiled. The mug in my hands was chipped near the base, a small imperfection I'd long stopped noticing. I had owned it for years. Sabrina once told me it didn't match anything. That was the point. I like things that didn't ask permission to belong. The snow outside had started again, soft flakes drifting sideways in the wind. I stood by the window and watched them land on the railing, disappear, and be replaced. Some things fall apart quietly, until one day there's nothing left but white. At 2:15, the first call came in. I didn't answer. Instead, I walked to the living room, checked the folder on the coffee table, and counted the copies again. 14, one for each dinner guest, labeled and numbered. Each one included statements, letters, dates, signatures. Truth doesn't need decoration, only order. I returned to the kitchen, sat back down, and finished my coffee. The phone lit up again. At 2:47, another call, this time from Ethan. I watched the screen glow on the counter, his name appearing over and over like it had something new to say. I didn't move. At 3:20, another call, then 3:31, then 3:39. I let them pile up. At 3:45, the phone rang 5 times in a row. I powered it off. In the silence that followed, I felt no anxiety, no fear of what might happen, only space, the kind of space that grows when you stop filling it with other people's expectations. I stood, rinsed my mug, and wiped the counter down. The dish towel smelled faintly of lavender, the same scent Maria used to keep in his dresser drawers, the kind that reminded you some things don't ask to be noticed. They just soften the air. I lit a candle on the windowsill, not because anyone would see it, but because I liked the way it flickered against the falling snow. At 4 hours, I opened the fridge, took out a loaf of bread, and set butter on the counter to soften. I moved slowly, not because I was tired, but because there was no reason to rush. Let them wait. Let them stand in baggage claim, checking the time, red-faced and murmuring about dignity and disrespect. Let them wonder where I was. For once, I had no interest in explaining myself. That, too, was a kind of justice. By 5 p.m., the snow had thickened. I stood at the window, watching the flakes fall in spirals, slow and steady. The road outside had gone soft and white. Cars moved carefully, people bundled tight. Everyone was heading somewhere, but I stayed home. At 5:15, I brewed a pot of Earl Grey and set the table for one. Cloth napkin, ceramic mug, a small plate with lemon slices. I moved deliberately, hands calm. I folded the napkin into thirds and placed it beside the cup like I used to when guests came. Only now, there were no guests. And I didn't mind. The phone buzzed again. I didn't check it. I let it ring, then ring again. At 5:32, it rang 4 times in a row. Ethan, then Sabrina, then Ethan again. One from a number I didn't recognize, likely Celeste or Harold. I sat down at the table, poured the tea, and inhaled the steam. It smelled of bergamot and memory. I took a slow sip and let it linger. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even hurt anymore. I was somewhere quieter than both, a place they didn't know how to reach. The first voicemail came in just before 6. Sabrina's voice, clipped and cold. We've been waiting at the airport for over 3 hours. My parents are furious. I don't know what happened, but this is beyond disappointing. You said you'd take care of it. I didn't reply. At 6:14, Ethan left a message, too. His tone was different. Less rehearsed, more unsure. Mom, just call me, okay? We need to figure this out. But there was nothing to figure out. Everything had already been decided by them long ago when they chose a seat for everyone but me. The tea had cooled by the time I finished. I stood, rinsed the cup, and dried it with the same lavender towel. The evening moved gently, the kind of gentle that follows truth. At 7, the calls slowed. At 7:18, they started again, more frantic this time. I turned the phone over, letting the screen face down. They didn't know yet. Not really. Not the extent of what had changed. Not what they had lost. But they were starting to feel it. By 8:00, the snow had thickened. I lit a small lamp in the corner of the room and watched its glow settle into the wood of the table, the curve of the chair, the pages of the open folder nearby. I didn't open it tonight. I didn't need to. The truth was ready. It didn't require urgency, only timing. At 8:27, the screen lit up one last time. I turned it over. 27 missed calls. I said the number out loud. Then I smiled. Freedom doesn't always arrive with fanfare. Sometimes it looks like silence on a screen. And sometimes it tastes like Earl Grey and quiet. I made grilled cheese and tomato soup for dinner. Simple, steady, warm. The kind of meal I used to make when Ethan was a boy and the weather turned. Back then, he'd sit at the counter swinging his feet, asking if the cheese would stretch when he pulled the sandwich apart. I always made sure it did. Now, the kitchen was quiet. No questions, no feet swinging. Just me and the sound of butter hissing in the pan. I ladled the soup into a white ceramic bowl and set it gently on the table. Folded a napkin, poured a glass of water, lit a candle, not for romance, not for ceremony, just to make the silence flicker a little less. I sat down and took a bite. The bread was crisp, the cheese still warm and soft. I dipped it in the soup and ate slowly, with both hands wrapped around the bowl. The window beside me fogged slightly with the heat. Outside, snow dusted the porch rail like powdered sugar. I thought about all the Christmas dinners I'd helped prepare. Roasts carved, pies cooled, children settled into bed with full stomachs and sticky fingers. The chairs I pulled out, the dishes I washed, the laughter I watched from a polite distance once the conversation turned to topics I wasn't part of. There had always been someone else at the center. I had simply kept the corners neat. But tonight, the center was mine. No place settings for people who couldn't say thank you. No leftovers packed in containers for those who forgot who paid for the meal. No need to ask who wanted tea or coffee. I already knew. I rinsed my bowl and wiped the counter. The sponge left clean lines across the tile. The soft scent of basil and tomatoes lingered in the air. Peace doesn't always look like a grand gesture. Sometimes it's a clean kitchen and a quiet table. I stood by the window for a while, holding my glass of water, watching snow settle over the street. The world outside moved slowly, like it was catching its breath. Inside, I had already caught mine. There were no footsteps on the porch, no cars pulling into the drive, just the wind and the hum of the heater and the memory of a sandwich shared long ago. I didn't miss them, not in the way they might hope. What I missed was being valued, and that I had reclaimed. I blew out the candle. The smoke curled upward and vanished. Freedom was served warm tonight. The knock came just after 5. Not a polite tap, a fist against wood, fast and insistent. I had just finished washing the dishes, still in my apron, when I heard it echo through the house. I didn't hurry to the door. Instead, I dried my hands slowly, folded the towel over the oven handle, and looked once around the kitchen. Everything in its place. Another knock, louder now. I walked to the front hallway and peeked through the curtain. Harold stood on the porch in a dark overcoat, his face red with cold and fury. Beside him, Celeste looked tight-lipped, her hair stiff under the wind. And in the middle, coat half-buttoned, stood Sabrina, her expression a mix of exhaustion and disbelief. I unlocked the door, but didn't open it all the way. "Evening," I said, calm as candlelight. Harold exploded first. "We waited 3 hours at the airport." His voice startled a bird from the tree across the street. 4, Celeste snapped. "In a terminal full of strangers, with no word, no explanation. Barbaric behavior, Vera. Truly." I opened the door a little wider and stepped aside. "It's cold. Come in," I said. No need for the neighbors to be disturbed. They entered stiffly, coats shaking off snow, boots tapping on the mat. No one said thank you. I led them into the living room. The fire had been burning low for hours, casting a soft orange across the walls. I gestured to the couch. They didn't sit. Sabrina looked at me like she was searching for the person I used to be. "I don't understand," she said. "You agreed." I nodded. "I did. But you didn't show up." "I showed up," I said. "Just not where you expected." Harold took a step forward, nostrils flaring. "You humiliated us. My wife and I, esteemed people in this community, were left stranded like forgotten luggage." I raised an eyebrow. "Stranded?" I walked to the side table and poured myself a glass of water. "Seems to me you were just momentarily unsupervised." Celeste gasped. "How dare you speak like that?" I turned to her. "How long have I let you speak to me like something beneath the crystalware?" They blinked. Sabrina stepped forward. "You've changed." "No," I said, taking a sip. "I've remembered who I was before you decided who I should be." The fire popped softly. No one moved. They had come expecting apology, confusion, a flustered explanation wrapped in baked goods and weak smiles. But I had none to offer. I walked past them, opened the closet, and took out their coats. "You're welcome to stay for tea," I said. "But I suspect you didn't come for peace, and I'm not offering war." Harold grabbed his coat. "You'll regret this." I handed it to him gently. "I already did." Then I stopped. Sabrina looked down at her shoes. Celeste wrapped her scarf tight, as if the cold was my doing. As they turned toward the door, I spoke once more. "You entered this house tonight in fury, but you entered my house." They paused. "And I hope," I said, "you remember how that felt." They didn't stay long. Celeste brushed past me as she left, muttering under her breath. Harold gave me a final glare, like a man still convinced the world owed him silence. Sabrina hesitated at the threshold. Her mouth opened slightly, as if she wanted to say something, maybe an explanation, maybe a plea. But the words never came. I didn't rush her. I didn't rescue her. I simply stood there, hand on the doorknob, waiting. She walked out into the snow without looking back. The door shut with a soft click, a final period to a sentence I hadn't spoken aloud. I stood for a moment, watching their figures recede into the night. Their car door slammed. The engine roared. Then tires spun briefly against the frozen curb before gaining traction. Gone. I turned the lock. The house exhaled. I walked back into the kitchen and poured a fresh glass of water. No trembling. No regret. The air inside was warm, still scented faintly of cedar and lemon soap. The fire had quieted into embers, flickering low but steady. The kind of flame that lasts. I carried my glass to the front window and pulled the curtain just wide enough to see them drive off. No headlights flashed. No one waved. The car turned at the corner and disappeared. The street returned to stillness. That's when I heard it, my phone buzzing on the side table. Not a call this time. A message. I picked it up. "We have connections in Denver," the text read. "Be careful how you carry yourself." No name, but I didn't need one. Celeste was never subtle. Her threats always wore pearls and punctuation. I stared at the screen for a moment, then turned it off again. I walked to the fire, picked up the iron poker, and stirred the logs once. The embers flared, briefly brighter. Then I sat down and whispered to the room, "It's quieter without you." Outside, snow continued to fall. Soft, relentless, the kind that builds quietly until the weight of it becomes undeniable. Some threats melt faster than snowflakes, and some silences are louder than doors slamming. 3 days later, I found myself standing in line at the corner market, waiting to pay for milk and oranges when I saw it, Page 3 of the Denver Ledger, folded neatly on the rack beside the gum and mints. A photo of me, grainy, taken from an unflattering angle, walking to my car in the snow. Above it, the headline, "Businesswoman Abandons Elderly Couple in Holiday Blizzard." I blinked. The snow hadn't even broken 32 degrees that day. I bought the paper. At home, I laid it flat on the table and read every word. The article painted a vivid portrait, one I didn't recognize. According to the writer, I had failed to pick up Celeste and Harold Baker from the airport, leaving them stranded in freezing conditions without warning or apology. The piece made vague references to generational neglect and shocking disregard for tradition. They even quoted an anonymous source close to the family who said, "It's heartbreaking to see someone who once gave so much become so cold." I didn't feel heartbreak. I felt precision. They weren't just angry. They were strategic. They were trying to control the narrative before it slipped from their grip. I read the byline, Paige Lawson, staff writer. The name rang a faint bell. I walked to the desk, opened my laptop, and searched. Her name popped up on LinkedIn. Mutual connections, publicists, editors, 2 local political consultants, and Ethan. Of course. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen. They rewrote the weather, and they tried to rewrite me. I turned the paper back over and underlined a sentence in red ink. Baker family sources claim they were left to fend for themselves after a long-standing family agreement was violated. Agreement? There was never an agreement. There were expectations, implied demands, and a long unspoken contract where I gave and they took. But no one had ever asked what I needed, what I wanted, whether I had boundaries. They assumed I had none. I picked up the phone and scrolled through my recent calls. Ethan's name still sat there, over and over, unanswered. I hovered over it, but didn't press dial. Instead, I opened a drawer and pulled out the folder. Again, page after page of documented truth. Dates, transfers, emails, voicemails, all the quiet proof of how I had been erased and expected to fund it. They had their ink. I had my records. I didn't need to scream. I only needed to speak, on my terms. I sat at the kitchen table, the newspaper still open beside me, and opened my laptop. The house was quiet, but my breath was steady. I moved slowly, not out of hesitation, but out of care. There's a difference. I opened my email, typed in the address listed at the bottom of the article, page.lawson@denverledger.com. Subject line, correction request, Baker article. I kept the message simple. Dear Ms. Lawson, I read your piece in the Denver Ledger dated December 21st. I am the woman in the photo, Vera Caldwell. I'm writing to request a formal correction. Attached, you will find the following, a screenshot of the text message requesting the airport pickup. The weather report from the day in question, high 52 degrees. A call log showing 27 unanswered calls. Bank documentation and legal status confirming my position as sole trustee of the Caldwell Family Trust. A copy of Clause 7.3 of the trust document. I believe your readers deserve the truth, and I believe good journalism does too. Sincerely, Vera Caldwell. I attached the files carefully, double-checked the formatting, and pressed send. The message flew off into silence. I stared at the screen for a moment longer, half expecting an immediate reply. There was none, and I didn't need one. Truth doesn't beg for attention. It waits. I closed the laptop and walked into the living room. The fire had gone out, but the warmth lingered. I pulled the curtains back and looked out into the dark. Streetlights glowed on the snow like distant lanterns. The world outside didn't care who wrote what in a column. but I did. By the end of the next day, there was still no reply, no acknowledgement, no correction, no apology. So I opened a new folder, labeled it Public Record. Inside, I placed the article, my email, the attachments, a screenshot of the timestamp. Then I added a fresh page titled Distribution Plan. If they wanted to speak in public, I would answer the same way, but not with gossip, with documentation, with clarity, with fact. I poured a glass of water and took one long sip. They had gone public first. I would go truthful next. The morning light came through the kitchen window in quiet ribbons. I didn't rush to make coffee. I didn't turn on the news. I sat at the table with the leather folder, opened it wide, and laid out the truth. Not the emotional kind, the paper kind. I started with the bank statements. I highlighted every transfer made to Ethan or Sabrina in the last 5 years. Rent coverage, emergency funds, mortgage payments. I attached deposit confirmations, each one marked with my name. Next came the gift letters. I had kept copies of every note I signed to help them secure their mortgage. Each one began with, "This is a non-repayable financial gift." At the time, it felt generous. Now, it felt like the first stone in a wall I didn't know I was building around myself. Receipts followed. Grocery bills from weeks they forgot their wallet. The West Elm order I paid for under my account. The Amazon charges they promised to reimburse. I printed screenshots from my email archive where Sabrina had written, "You're a lifesaver, Vera. I don't know what we'd do without you." They no longer remembered those words. I hadn't forgotten. I pulled up social media posts and printed those too. One showed Sabrina hosting a lavish baby shower. In the caption, she thanked her incredible support system, a list that included Celeste, a florist, and 3 brand sponsors. Not me. I had paid for the cake. I added the screenshot to the file. Then came the emails. I arranged them chronologically. The request for help with Ethan's business license fees. The forwarded notice for Sabrina's student loan deadline. The email asking for a bridge loan, just for a few weeks that never returned. The record grew taller. I opened my phone and took screenshots of all 27 missed calls, printed them in a single sheet with timestamps. On another sheet, I included the weather report for the airport pickup day. 52 degrees, partly cloudy, no wind. I circled the part that listed the unseasonably warm conditions for December. At the bottom, I wrote in pen. They called it a blizzard. I clipped each stack with care, placed them in labeled folders, and tucked them into my briefcase. Black leather, clean edges, same one I'd used when I signed my final will with Maria beside me. Every lie they told had a receipt I kept. Every omission came with a matching document. They hadn't counted on that. They assumed kindness erased memory. It didn't. By noon, the table was clear. 14 folders, identical in weight and truth. I snapped the case shut. If they wanted dinner served with appearances, I would bring something more filling. They wanted a story. I would give them documentation. I opened the kitchen drawer and pulled out the calendar. It was the same one I'd used all year. Floral print, thick pages, taped once in the corner where a coffee spill had curled the edge. I flipped to December and circled the 24th in red ink. A clean ring, like sealing something shut. Christmas Eve. They had chosen the battlefield, a dinner party full of polished guests, candlelight, and name cards with silent meanings. But I would choose the terms. 6:30 p.m. That was when Sabrina said dinner would begin, per the email she sent 2 weeks ago with attached seating charts and a gentle reminder to please be subtle with conversation topics. I hadn't been on the chart. I'd been listed as TBD. Now I knew exactly where I belonged. I stood and walked to the hall closet. The black leather case waited on the top shelf, beside an old wool shawl and a pair of boots Maria once polished every winter. I reached up, brought it down carefully, and set it on the dining table. One by one, I removed the folders and opened each. I adjusted the order, labeled the spines, checked the corner staples. 14 copies, evenly stacked, perfectly aligned. Bank statements, legal documents, weather reports, screenshots, emails. All truth, unadorned, unavoidable. Each guest would receive one, not out of spite, out of clarity. I placed the stacks back in the case and closed the latch with a soft click. Then I wrapped a red ribbon around the handle, just one small bow, a holiday touch. I imagined the table at Cherry Creek, gold flatware, crystal glasses, floral centerpieces that matched the napkins. I imagined the polished laughter, the glances, the carefully curated playlist humming in the background, and I imagined the moment when I would arrive, not with fury, with facts. They would expect a scene or a retreat. Instead, I'd bring something stronger. Truth, printed on paper, handed out like place cards. No accusations, no raised voice, just presence. And presence, when unexpected, is its own kind of power. I looked at the calendar again. Christmas Eve would come dressed in justice. I arrived at 6:45 sharp. The Cherry Creek house stood as it always had, grand and glowing, every window lit like a portrait. A wreath hung perfectly centered on the front door, and soft, instrumental music floated out each time someone entered or left. Laughter spilled from the porch, mingling with the scent of rosemary and roasted meat. I stepped out of my car slowly, leather case in hand, the red ribbon still tied neatly around the handle. Snow had been brushed from the walkway. Someone had salted the steps. Everything was designed to welcome, but only certain kinds of people. I walked up the path alone. At the door, a man in a black jacket greeted me, clearly hired help. He reached for the handle, paused slightly as he took me in, and then nodded. "Good evening," he said. "It is," I replied, and stepped inside. The foyer was filled with coats, perfume, the murmur of introductions. I moved past them without fuss. My boots made no sound on the marble floor. I could feel heads turning, faces shifting, a flicker of discomfort trailing behind me like a second shadow. The dining room was already full, 14 guests, seated around a table long enough to seat a council. Sabrina stood at the far end, dressed in navy silk, her face lit by candlelight, and just enough tension to crack porcelain. She saw me and froze. Conversation stuttered. A fork dropped. The air changed, slightly but definitively. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't smile. I simply stepped forward, lifted the leather case onto the sideboard with both hands, and said, "Good evening, everyone." Silence rippled outward. "I hope you don't mind," I continued, carefully opening the case. "I brought a few receipts." Sabrina's face tightened. "Vera, this isn't the time." "No," I agreed, looking her in the eye. "It's the truth, and the truth tends to show up exactly when it's least convenient." She took a step toward me. "This is inappropriate." "So is ingratitude," I said gently, and began removing folders, one by one. The guests looked on, unsure whether to intervene or pretend nothing was happening. Ethan hadn't stood. His hands gripped the edge of the table. His eyes never left mine. I placed a folder in front of Harold. Then Celeste. Then the neighbor Sabrina often bragged about hosting. One by one, I moved around the table, not hurried, not hesitant. Each folder had a name. Each folder told a story. Bank transfers, letters, emails, dates, facts, no opinion, no accusation. Just a record of silence finally, speaking. When I reached Ethan, I paused. He looked up at me, pale, quiet, unsure. I placed the final folder in front of him. "This one," I said, "is in your name, because that's the one I trusted most." He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Around the table, pages rustled. Glasses remained untouched. The music still played from the other room, too cheerful now, like a background lie. I stepped back. "They say stories get passed down through families," I said. "But sometimes they get buried, erased, rewritten by the loudest voice in the room." I let the words hang there. Tonight I decided not to be erased. Sabrina's lips parted to respond, but no sound came. I nodded once, calm and complete. Then I turned and walked toward the door. Not rushed, not dismissed. Seen, heard, accounted for. I reached the front door before I heard the voice. "Where did the down payment come from?" It was the HOA attorney. A man named Richard, seated halfway down the table, gray hair neatly combed, napkin still folded in his lap. He wasn't asking out of curiosity. He was asking out of precision. The room froze. Sabrina stiffened. Harold blinked. Celeste slowly turned her head toward Ethan, who now sat with his hands pressed flat on the folder, as if holding it shut might hold the truth inside. I turned back, slowly. "The down payment," I said clearly, "came from my retirement fund. Transferred on August 14th, 5 years ago. Page 2, second line." Richard opened his folder, flipped, found the line, and nodded once. Someone else at the table whispered, "Oh my God." I walked back toward the dining room, not too close, just far enough to make eye contact. "There's also a copy of the mortgage letter," I said. "The one where I signed a non-repayable gift declaration. That one was needed to close the loan after they came up short. Page 3. Chairs shifted. Pages turned. The sound of paper grew louder than the Christmas music humming in the background. "And if you go to page 5, I continued, "you'll find a list of cash transfers, groceries, childcare, tuition installments, car repairs, each one with a matching confirmation from my bank." Sabrina opened her folder and skimmed quickly. Her hand trembled slightly. Celeste leaned over her shoulder, reading fast. Harold's jaw tightened, his spoon forgotten midair. "I also included the weather report from December 18th, I said, "for those concerned about the so-called blizzard I left them in." A soft laugh escaped from the man seated nearest the end, then silence again. "And," I added, "for those wondering why the family trust account is frozen, please refer to clause 7.3. Ethan looked up at me, his eyes darker than I remembered. Not angry, just opened. Sabrina stood now. "This was meant to be a private gathering." "It was never private," I said. "Not after the newspaper article. Not after the voicemails. Not after the dinner invitation that listed me as TBD. Richard spoke again, this time softly. "She's right. It's all here." Celeste's cheeks were flushed. "This isn't the place." "It's exactly the place," I said, "because this is where the performance was going to happen. And I thought the guests deserved something honest for dessert." Another ripple of murmurs. I stepped toward the case, slowly, and closed it with a quiet snap. "You fed on my silence," I said gently. "Tonight, you'll digest the facts." I looked at Ethan once more. His folder still lay closed in front of him, but he had heard everything. maybe more than anyone. I loved you, I said, and I'll always want the best for you, but I won't finance my own erasure. Then I nodded once to the room. Enjoy your dinner, I said. It's the last one I'll ever pay for. And I walked out, my boots clicking softly against the tile, the warmth of truth behind me, and nothing I owed left in the air. 3 months later, a white envelope arrived in my mailbox. It was marked confidential in bold lettering from a bank I knew too well. I didn't open it right away. I made tea first, let the water steep dark and strong, and sat by the window. The sky had started to turn, winter folding itself into spring little by little. I finally slit the envelope open with a butter knife and unfolded the letter. Notice of default. The Bakers had missed 3 payments on the line of credit tied to their property. The amount due, $8,400 with penalties increasing monthly. A polite paragraph explained the options: resolve the balance or prepare for escalation. I read it twice, slowly, not out of pleasure, not even out of justice, just confirmation. They had built a life on borrowed presents, a lifestyle held up by appearances, by other people's generosity dressed as tradition. They never thought the ledger would be read aloud. They never imagined the receipts would be redistributed. Now the paper spoke what I had once whispered alone in my kitchen. I folded the letter and set it beside the stove. No calls came. No apologies followed. There were no more invitations, no more emails asking if I could just swing by or help smooth something over. Only silence. But it was the good kind now. The kind that follows honesty, not exile. I poured my tea and stood at the window. The snow was gone. The garden bed along the fence had started to soften. Little signs of green pushed through the dirt. The world was doing what it always did when truth had its season. It thawed. I took the letter, walked it to the filing cabinet, and slid it into a new folder labeled Postscript. Then I opened a second envelope, this one from my own bank. A simple statement. My account balance, unchanged, steady, frozen still, held in trust, just like my peace. I smiled. Their debts had finally spoken louder than mine, and I was done paying for silence. I spent the next few weeks with a paintbrush in one hand and a small notebook in the other. The house needed love, not fixing, just love. The kind of care that says, I choose to stay here. The kind I had given other people's homes for years without ever offering it to my own. I started with the light fixtures. One by one, I replaced the old bulbs with soft golden LEDs. I scrubbed the glass domes until they shone like clean truth. The hallway brightened first, then the kitchen, then the little reading nook by the front window where Maria used to sit with his crossword and a cup of black coffee. Next came the walls. I picked a warm taupe for the living room, the kind of color that softened late afternoon sun. In the bathroom, I painted the trim a deep slate blue, bold, not loud. I touched up the door frames, patched the nicks left by moving furniture and time. I pulled weeds from the garden bed out back, reseeded the patch of grass that had gone thin in the corner. I planted 2 small rose bushes, even though it was early for blooms. I didn't mind waiting. Some homes grow warmer once empty. The mailbox no longer held bills that weren't mine. The phone didn't ring with hollow requests. The silence in my home had changed. It no longer echoed. It settled. It stayed. One morning, I stood in the kitchen doorway, coffee in hand, and looked around. New light fixtures, fresh paint. Flowers starting to bud along the walkway. Nothing extravagant, nothing for show. But it was mine. Every inch reflected presence, not performance. I picked up the notebook and drew a line through the last item. Repair hallway light. Then I closed it and tucked it in the drawer beside the sink. Outside, a child laughed somewhere down the block. A dog barked once, then quieted. The sky was the color of early hope. Spring had come. Not all at once, not loudly, but here. The kind of spring you notice only when you're finally looking for it. I had not noticed how dim the house had become. It was a quiet thing, the way neglect settles over time. Not damage, just a slow fading of light, of spirit. But once the account was frozen and my phone silenced, I began to see clearly again. It started with a bulb in the hallway that flickered one too many times. I replaced it. Then I replaced another, then all of them. Soft, golden light returned to the corners of my home, one fixture at a time. In the evenings, I would sit by the window with a cup of tea and watch the city breathe. Denver had always felt too wide for me after Maria passed. But now, in the stillness, I saw it differently. The same streets, the same sky, but something inside me had turned. There was room now, room for breath, room for thought, room for peace. I started waking up earlier. I painted the kitchen a warm taupe, the kind of color that absorbs morning light gently. I oiled the old oak cabinets. I fixed the drawer that always stuck and replaced the curtain that had faded to near transparency. I rearranged the spice rack, even, though no one else would ever notice. It wasn't about impressing anyone. It was about choosing myself. I walked through the house with a notepad, listing everything I'd postponed. The sticky window, the wobbly banister, the dead lavender bush out front. I completed each one, slowly, quietly. I replaced things not because they were broken, but because I was finally ready for better. The fireplace had not been used since the night of the red wine. That night had sealed something for me, both an ending and a beginning. Now, I cleaned the hearth and set new kindling, ready for a different kind of warmth. I bought a new photo frame for the image of Maria and me on our last trip to the coast. He was laughing in that photo, head tilted slightly, his carpenter's hands resting on the railing. I placed it on the mantel, beside the vase of fresh lilies. The sun hit that corner every morning. It felt right. I returned the leather folder to the top drawer in my bedroom. Trust Clause 7.3 had served its purpose. There was power in action. But now, that power didn't need to be loud. It only needed to be real. One morning, I stepped outside with my gloves on and trimmed the hedge line for the first time in a year. The air was crisp, but the sunlight had softened. Denver in early spring always brought a false sense of warmth, but I didn't mind. A child from 2 doors down waved to me on her scooter. I waved back. Later that day, I found the box of Maria's tools in the garage. I ran my fingers over each one, remembering how he used to hum while sanding wood or fixing a hinge. I cleaned the rust off a small hand plane and left it out on the workbench. Not because I needed it, just because I wanted to see it again. That night, I lit a single candle on the dining table. No guests, no performance, just soup, bread, and quiet music from the radio. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel invisible in my own house. The rooms had not changed, but I had. And somehow, that made all the difference. It was a Tuesday morning when Rosa came by. I had just finished wiping down the windowsills and folding the laundry still warm from the dryer when I heard the knock, 2 gentle raps, the kind that signal kindness instead of demand. I opened the door to find her standing there in her long blue coat, cheeks pink from the cold, holding a small box of lemon muffins tied with a piece of twine. "I bake too many," she said, which we both knew was a lie. I stepped aside and waved her in. "I have fresh tea." She didn't comment on the new paint or the smell of citrus polish in the air, but her eyes moved across the room, resting for a beat on the picture frame of Maria, the flowers in the corner, the golden light spilling in across the kitchen tiles. "It's quieter here now," she finally said, slipping off her gloves. "Peaceful kind of quiet," I replied. "Not the empty kind." She nodded, her expression soft. We sat at the table, the one that had once held Christmas meals and now held 2 steaming mugs and a plate of split muffins. Rosa picked hers apart gently. "There's been talk," she said. "I imagine so. You know how people are. They don't know anything, but they fill in the blanks anyway." I let the steam from my tea curl around my face. "I'm used to being misunderstood. I just didn't expect it from my own blood." Rosa looked at me, her voice low and steady. "I don't know what happened between you and Ethan, but I do know this. No child who values their mother leaves her alone on Christmas." I didn't answer. I didn't need to. She leaned forward, elbows on the table like we were girls again. "Do you want to talk about it?" I hesitated. The truth was, I didn't want to retell the story. Not because I was ashamed, but because I had finally stopped needing to justify myself. So I shook my head gently. "I'd rather talk about what's next." That made her smile. "Good, because there's something I wanted to ask you." She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small folded flyer. It was for a neighborhood fundraiser. Something modest, a community drive for the local shelter. Rosa was organizing baked goods and silent donations. She tapped the page with her nail. "We could use someone good with numbers and strong tea." I smiled. "I have both." She laughed and set the flyer down, then leaned back in her chair. "You know, the ladies at church always used to say you were too quiet, too reserved." "I used to think that was a flaw," I said. "Now I think it's armor." "Not armor," Rosa said gently. "Strength." We sat in silence for a while, the comfortable kind. After she left, I rinsed the mugs and stood at the sink, looking out at the street. A light snow had started again, thin flakes drifting like dust over the sidewalk. The sky was pale, but not gray, just waiting. I walked to the hallway closet and opened the cedar box where I kept Maria's letters. I hadn't touched them in weeks, not because I didn't want to, but because I finally felt like I was carrying them with me now. They had moved from paper to presents. Still, I opened the top one. His handwriting curved like old branches, steady, sure. "You'll know when the house feels like home again, and you won't need anyone to tell you." I closed the letter and tucked it back in place. Then I walked outside. The air was cold, but not harsh. I pulled my coat close, not because I was retreating, but because I was ready to step forward. Across the street, Rosa waved from her porch. I raised a hand in reply. The world had not changed, but the space I took up in it had. That afternoon, I made a small list, not for repairs, but for moments. Things I wanted to do now that the weight had shifted. Paint the garden chairs. Invite Rosa for soup. Send a card to Elena, the attorney's assistant, who had been more than kind. Find the perfect frame for the photo of me and Maria by the sea. No grand gestures, no declarations, just quiet things that felt real. In the evening, I lit the fireplace again, not because I needed heat, but because the glow reminded me of something Maria once said, It's not the warmth of the fire. It's knowing who lit it for you. This time, I lit it for myself. That night, after Rosa left and the dishes were put away, I sat by the fireplace with the red leather folder on my lap. The same one that once held estate statements, notarized titles, photocopied affidavits. Now, it was almost empty, except for one last piece of paper I hadn't decided what to do with. A printed message, folded neatly. I opened it. It was a letter, not handwritten, but typed and unsigned. Left in my mailbox 2 mornings ago, just 6 lines. Mom, I made a mistake. I should have said it to your face, but I didn't know how. Sabrina is gone. They all are. I miss you. Can we talk? No name, no return address, no apology, not really. But it was from Ethan. I knew his rhythm, the way he avoided hard words, the way he always asked, "Can we talk?" when he already had something to say. I stared at the page until the edges blurred. Some part of me had waited for this, but another part, the one that sat through Christmas Eve alone, that poured 1 glass of wine instead of 2, that stared at the 27 missed calls blinking on a screen while the snow kept falling, knew better than to jump at the first sign of regret. Love, when used carelessly, becomes a rope. It tethers you, tightens around you, pulls you back to places you've outgrown. So I held the letter in my hand for a while. Then I slid it back into the folder. I did not cry. Instead, I turned toward the framed photo of Maria and me at the lake. He had his hand resting over mine in that photo, just gently, not possessive, just presence. That was his way. He taught me that boundaries weren't the absence of love. They were the proof of it. If I had learned that earlier, maybe Ethan would have too, but I couldn't go back. I had set limits now, not from anger, but from clarity. He could talk, but I would listen differently this time. I closed the folder and placed it back in the drawer beside the fireplace. Then I picked up the little ceramic bowl that held our old house keys. I still had the spare to Ethan's home. I had never used it, never needed to. But now, I dropped it into a small padded envelope, wrote his name on the front, and sealed it. Some gifts are quieter than others. The next morning, I placed the envelope in the mail. No return address, no note, just the key. That was my reply. That night, Rosa called to ask if I would help host the bake table for the fundraiser. I said yes. She said, "I knew you'd show up. You always do, just in your own time." I smiled, pressing the phone to my shoulder as I stirred honey into my tea. "Boundaries are just fences," I told her, "not walls. And fences still have gates," she said. We didn't talk much more than that. But when I hung up, I felt something I hadn't felt in months, maybe years. Stillness that wasn't loneliness, and quiet that wasn't punishment. Just peace, resting where chaos had once lived. The church was humming with soft voices and the faint scent of baked sugar. It was Saturday morning, and I had offered to arrive early. I carried 2 trays of lemon shortbread and my old blue thermos of coffee. The folding tables were already up, clothed in white. Someone had tied ribbons around the backs of the chairs. Rosa waved from across the room, her apron dusted in flour. "I saved you the corner," she called out. "Best spot. People have to walk by you twice." I smiled and set my things down. We worked together quietly, slicing pastries, laying napkins, arranging the little signs, almond tartlets, apple butter muffins, Vera's shortbread. Rosa leaned over and whispered, "Yours will be the first to go." I shrugged. "It's just sugar and flour." "No, honey," she said. "It's memory." I looked around. There were faces I'd seen before, but never truly known. A widow from 3 doors down brought gingerbread. The teenager from the next block helped move the donation jars. Even the choir director showed up with his hands full of carrot cake and a story about how he always burns the first batch. People came, they bought, they stayed. No one asked about Ethan. No one tiptoed around last names. They just thanked me for the cookies. They complimented my sweater. They told me I looked well. And for the first time in a long time, I believed them. Around noon, a little girl approached my table. She had $2 in her mitten and wanted to know if I'd trade one cookie for a smile. I said yes. She bit into the shortbread and said, "This tastes like grandma hugs." I laughed. "Is that a good thing?" "The best thing," she said with a mouth full of crumbs. When she skipped away, I felt the warmth behind my eyes, but I didn't cry. I looked at Rosa. "You were right," I said. "It was memory." She nodded. "It always is." Later, we sat outside on the church steps. The air was cold but bright. My scarf was tucked tightly around my throat, and I held a paper cup of cocoa with both hands. "Do you ever think about what makes a family?" I asked. "All the time," Rosa said. "And?" She glanced at the sky. "I think real family are the ones who don't need you to shrink, the ones who make space, not just at the table, but in their life, in their plans." I thought of the long Cherry Creek table with its 12 velvet chairs, and the chair I was never offered. "And when blood isn't that?" I asked. She looked at me with that gaze that saw too much but judged nothing. "Then you plant new roots," she said. "Doesn't mean you stop loving the old ones. Just means you don't keep returning to poisoned soil." I didn't reply. I just stared out at the street, at the way the light hit the edge of the curb, at how the snow had finally melted into clean concrete. That night, I lit the fireplace again. I opened my journal, not the red folder, just the spiral-bound one I'd had for years, but never filled. I wrote 5 names on the first page: Rosa, Linda, Maria, Elise, me. No last names, just women who showed up, women who stood for love in action, not just in holiday cards. I wrote a note to myself beneath them. Family isn't blood. Family is who stays when it's quiet. Family is who believes your story without needing proof. Then I closed the book and placed it back on the shelf. Not to forget, but to remember what I had chosen. That Sunday morning, sunlight slipped through the blinds like an old friend. No fanfare, no noise, just warmth. I didn't rush to get up. I pulled the comforter closer, held the stillness like a delicate thing. Outside, the snow was finally thinning. What remained glittered on rooftops like salt. I poured a slow cup of coffee, opened the curtains wide, and stood barefoot on the rug, letting the light reach my face. On the window glass, I traced the outline of the mountains with my finger, like I used to do with Ethan when he was 5. He once said, "The snow makes everything quiet, Mama." I whispered back, "So you can hear your heart better." That morning, I heard mine clearly. It didn't ache. It didn't whisper regrets. It simply said, "You're here, still here." I sipped my coffee by the fireplace. The red folder lay unopened on the side table now, not because it wasn't important, but because it didn't control the air in the room anymore. Beside it sat something new, a letter. Handwritten, uneven script, folded twice. Ethan's name on the back, no stamp, left on my porch the night before. I hadn't opened it yet. I reached for it slowly, the way you reach for memory, the way you approach a wound that's almost healed but still tender. The first line read, "Mom, I don't deserve this space on your table, but if you ever make tea again, I'd sit quietly and just listen. The rest of the letter was shaky, not poetic, not full of grand apologies. Just truth. He wrote about the pressure, about Sabrina's parents, about the way he felt stuck between two homes and chose the one that applauded him louder. He ended with this: I know what I lost. I see what I tried to sell and silence. I miss your shortbread. I miss you standing in the doorway waiting with that blue scarf you always wore. I miss the version of myself who used to make you laugh. I'm sorry, Mom. Love, Ethan. I folded the letter back gently, set it down. I didn't cry. I just breathed. And the breath was different this time. Not held, not shallow, full. The sun moved across the floor like a slow dance. I opened the front door and stepped out barefoot onto the porch. The air kissed my skin. Not cold, not warm, just clean. Linda waved from across the street. She held up a jar of homemade jam. I made too much, she said. I smiled. That's the best kind. She walked over, placed it in my hands, raspberry with orange zest. You have plans for Easter? She asked. Not yet. Well, she said, we've got room, and real forks this time. We both laughed. She pointed to the sky. Snow's finally giving up. I looked up. The clouds were thin. The sky wasn't quite blue, but it was trying. It's time, I said softly. I went back inside, wrapped Ethan's letter in a ribbon, and placed it in a drawer beside my wedding photo and Maria's favorite old pen. Not to forget, but to hold the memory with care. Then I set a kettle on the stove, pulled down 2 mugs. I didn't know what would come next, whether Ethan would knock again or call, whether Sabrina would ever say my name without disdain. But I knew this. Snow melts, and when it does, sometimes hearts soften too. I took the first sip of tea and let it warm everything the snow had once silenced.